Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching this class. This is the SUPA Chapter 29 lecture. This is the last lecture from the text that we're going to do this year. Needless to say, with everything that transpired with COVID and the school closure, the curriculum was modified a bit. Um, and this lecture is going to run through what is the week of June 1st to June 5th. So after that, we only have 3 weeks left of school anyway. So for today, I'm going to go through the first, I believe it's 11 or 12 slides. I'll let you know as we go through them. But what chapter 29, your textbook, gets into is it really gets into the cultural clash. This is where it starts. I mean, if you look at slide 2, the times they are changing, you know, the Bob Dylan phrase there. And really you start to see people protesting against the United States government and its actions. Well, let's think about why is this the times they are changing. Remember, it was a generation before this that, was successful in World War II, believed in the concept of that post-war prosperity, the baby boom, that American dream of the suburbs, and it was a time of like relative ease in the 1950s. But then you get into the 1960s and culture starts to change a bit. For instance, the first slide gets into, or excuse me, slide 2, it gets into, the college protest against the war. You have the civil rights movement occurring in the 1960s. Then you combine that with like the counterculture and the hippie movement, and people really kind of going against the conservative grain that kind of drove American culture in the 1950s. So, the 1960s was different. It was a different decade. It was a more turbulent decade. I always like to say when we look at the decades of the 20th century, the 1920s and the 1930s, obviously there's clear contrast between the two. With the false prosperity of the 20s and the depression of the 30s. And then the 1950s and the 1960s, I would tend to make the same argument. The 1950s, post-war prosperity, nationalism, and then the 1960s, it was more conflict and turmoil. Taking a look at slide 3, I mean, you can see the picture of the hippie family there. And when we think about the hippies, it's just a different style of dress, not as clean cut as the 1950s look per se in popular culture. They embraced different concepts, which would be shunned in many cases by the older generations. Examples: they accepted drug use, most notably LSD and marijuana. Communal living, people kind of sharing their belongings and living together. More like free love, and they were a little bit more open with their sexuality. These were ideas that, in the 1950s would seem so foreign, and then in the 1960s they kind of become a reality. And I mean, you can see the style there on slide 3 in your PowerPoint for chapter 29. I'm going to move on to slide 4, and this is where we get into war protest. The United States was divided into doves and hawks, with doves being a symbol of peace and being those that were anti-war, and hawks being a bird of prey who were pro-war. The Vietnam War would divide American society. Many young people helped lead the protest movement, but if you think about it, it ultimately makes sense because it was the young people who would be fighting the war. If you think about it, if you were alive during this time, it's 1966, and you're a freshman in college, and then you come home for Christmas break in 1966, and you go to a party with your friends, and you're wondering, well, where is Johnny? You're away in college, having the time of your life, and then you come home and you realize, oh, Johnny's in Vietnam, he got drafted. And you had many young people look at it like, this obviously wasn't a war of communist aggression against the United States. Vietnam's on the other side of the globe. North Vietnam is no threat to the United States. We could turn the country into a parking lot with our military technology. We showed that to the world at the conclusion of World War II. So you had a lot of young people question, why are we there? If it's about, people started questioning these wars to contain communism. And you started to see, turbulence because America was ultimately divided on it. And public opinion was polarized. And what that means is you had the doves and you had the hawks, and they were just polar opposites. Moving on to slide 5, You get into the hard hat riots, which occurred in New York, and think about it, that there were people who benefit from war. So if engaging in war is going to help a sector of the economy that you work in, you may support the foreign policy actions of the United States. Vietnam was no different. And the hard hat riots broke out because of that, because you had labor groups which did support Vietnam, the U.S. efforts in Vietnam, and they went after war protesters right in New York City. Moving on to slide 6. Slide 6, for the most part, is really just a chart, and it shows, mortality rates, and you can really see how they're impacted. I mean, really look at like 1960 and then what transpires. If you look at the numbers for males, there's like a steady decline. There's a decrease in the mortality rate, the age that people live. I mean, let's think of some of the factors that play into that. Not only Vietnam, but especially for African American males. Think about, you read about in Man Child in the Promised Land, the heroin epidemic, that ravaged through African American communities in northern cities. That's another aspect that applies there. Meanwhile, you see the average life expectancy for white females and black females, it's steadily climbing. And one would think during this time period, due to medical technology, pharmaceuticals, and medication, it would only make sense that people's life expectancy would climb, although for males it wasn't. And those are a couple factors, Vietnam, the heroin epidemic, which would apply to this. Moving on to number 7, poverty. One of the things that you really read about in Man Child of the Promised Land is you read about the impact of white flight on cities. The expression that sociologists often use is, the suburbs were white flight, and urban areas were left black, brown, and broke. Urban areas would be populated by minority groups, most notably African Americans and Hispanics, and you see there the higher poverty levels, for those groups. But you start to see the poverty levels decline when you look at that chart, really when you get into the 1960s. And part of that, and we're most notably from 1965 on, and one of the major reasons for that, is the Great Society launched by Lyndon Johnson. So Lyndon Johnson, who was Kennedy's successor after John F. Kennedy was killed, not only did he inherit the Vietnam War, which would ultimately destroy his presidency, but he was also trying to launch a massive domestic spending campaign. When I say that, that's along the lines of like the New Deal. Typically when we look at Democrats and Republicans, Democrats are associated with, the government should intervene in the economy, they can fix things, they can use legislation to improve, more government involvement. Whereas Republicans, it's more belief, hands off, get the federal government out of things and keep it more, laissez-faire capitalism, keep the federal government out. So when we look at the slide here that you have on LBJ and the Great Society, this is both slide 8 and slide 9. The goal of it really was to try to reduce poverty. Well, what are some of the ways that they tried to do it? Head Start. Head Start is a preschool, federal-funded preschool program which takes place where? In impoverished communities, to give poor kids a chance at that preschool education that many wealthy and affluent kids did have access to. The VISTA program, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, these are all considered the Great Society because they were trying to, end inequality, increase political participation, try to redistribute wealth, and try to help the poor climb out of poverty through federal legislation. The government can get involved and create a quote-unquote great society. Republicans typically oppose ideas like this. Democrats, you saw it with the New Deal, right? And, with Franklin Roosevelt, and you're kind of living through it now. I mean, just this past week, the House of Representatives passed a stimulus bill that provides federal assistance to try to help have the federal government assist state and local governments and people, climb out of this hole we're in because of COVID. The Senate, which is controlled by Republicans, they've yet to pass that bill. So the whole idea, can government kind of fix problems? And you can read the Great Society chart in slide 9, and you can see the slew of programs which were created. But the problem that Johnson ran into, how do you fund all this and fund a war where under your presidency, Lyndon Johnson, we had over 500,000, over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. Moving on to slide 10. Crisis in the cities. I think if you read Man Child in the Promised Land, you understand this. Man Child in the Promised Land highlights on everything on this slide. And it was those problems: racism, discrimination, lack of quality jobs, the heroin epidemic, lack of like land ownership. You had many tenants in African American tenants in northern cities, and they weren't owning real estate. And let's look at slide 11. It would be all of those things that you read about which would ultimately lead to the uprisings, which took place all across the country. And on slide 11, they're all highlighted there. I'm going to go one more slide. I'm going to go to slide 12, and we get into King, the war, and the assassination. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, Martin Luther King is the largest symbol of the civil rights movement of the 20th century. When he was assassinated, you had riots breaking out all over the country. And this shows the turmoil, the unrest, and really that uneasiness, the uncertainty of the 1960s. And that like 1950s post-war nationalism, we're the land of prosperity. We need to go provide a model for the rest of the world, and spread democracy. That was kind of that faith in government, those ideas in government were kind of eroding. I'm going to stop here at slide 12, and you'll get to finish this tomorrow. I hope that this finds you all well. If you guys have any questions, please reach out.